When the Homeowners Association sold 1,500 acres of prime farmland belonging to Elijah Carter, a quiet black landowner, they thought he'd roll over. But Elijah knew the law better than they did. What began as theft would end in a courtroom twist that left the HOA homeless, legally. Elijah Carter had never been a man to flaunt what he owned. He wasn't the type to post photos of himself standing next to his property lines or brag about acreage at the local feed store. His father had raised him to believe that the loudest men were often the weakest. So, Elijah kept his life quiet and measured, tending to the land the way his grandfather and great-grandfather had done before him. The Carter property stretched wide, 500 acres of rolling pasture, pine groves, and rich soil that could yield almost anything you planted in it. It wasn't just land. It was family legacy. The one thing that connected him to the ancestors, whose names were now fading on yellowed deeds tucked into a fireproof safe. The Carter land had been in the family since 1898, purchased by Elijah's great-grandfather, Thomas Carter, who had saved every penny from years of backbreaking work on the railroads. Thomas bought it outright, paid in full, because he knew that in America, a black man's security rested not in the goodwill of others but in the ground under his feet. It had survived recessions, droughts, and even an oil company's attempt to buy it out in the 70s. Through all of that, no Carter had ever signed it away, mortgaged it, or let it go for less than its worth. Elijah intended to keep it that way. It was early spring when the first letter came. At first glance, it didn't look like much, just a standard white envelope addressed to property owner from something called the Westbrook Homeowners Association, Inc. Elijah almost tossed it in the pile of junk mail, but the words "Notice of Delinquent Assessment" caught his eye. It claimed he owed $3,487.69 in HOA fees for unpaid annual assessments dating back 3 years. Elijah frowned. His property wasn't part of any subdivision, gated community, or HOA. His driveway was a half-mile dirt path off County Road 18. The closest thing to a neighbor was a cattle ranch 3 miles south. He called the number listed, and a woman with a clipped, perfunctory tone answered. "Westbrook HOA, this is Melanie." "There's been some kind of mistake," Elijah said, holding the letter. "I own a farm on County Road 18. I don't live in any HOA." "Sir, according to our records, your property is part of the Westbrook subdivision and subject to its covenants." "That's impossible." His voice stayed calm, but the words were firm. "The Carter property's been here long before your subdivision even existed." She clicked her tongue as if reading from a script. "If you believe there's an error, you'll need to submit a written dispute within 30 days. But please be advised, continued failure to pay may result in a lien on your property and potential foreclosure." Elijah hung up slowly. Something about the conversation gnawed at him, not just the arrogance, but the certainty in her tone, as if she had already decided what the truth was. 2 weeks later, he received another letter, this one stamped in red, "Final notice before lion." He didn't panic. He went to the courthouse in person, pulling the deed from his safe and walking straight into the county clerk's office. Mrs. Hargrove, the clerk who had known Elijah since high school, looked over the papers and frowned. "Elijah, this here says your parcel was reclassified 2 years ago. It's listed as part of Westbrook Subdivision, Phase 3. His jaw tightened. "That's impossible. I never sold, never signed a damn thing." Mrs. Hargrove flipped through her files and pulled out a copy of what looked like a plat map. Sure enough, his land, his 1,500 acres, was outlined in bright yellow under the Westbrook Subdivision label. The file also contained a recorded Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions (CC&R) document bearing a signature that claimed to be his. "That's not my signature," Elijah said, his voice low but shaking. Mrs. Hargrove gave him a look of quiet sympathy. "Elijah, this is fraud, but they've recorded it in the official records. If they file a lien, they can try to foreclose, and you'd have to fight it in court." It didn't take long for things to escalate. The HOA, apparently emboldened by their paperwork, filed a lien within weeks. Elijah received a foreclosure notice within 3 months. His attorney at the time, a local general practice lawyer named Bennett, filed a challenge, but the judge allowed the sale to proceed pending litigation. That was when Elijah learned just how stacked the deck could be. how something stolen from you could be legally sold if the paperwork looked right and you didn't have the resources to fight back. On a hot August morning, the property went up for auction at the courthouse steps. Elijah stood across the street, arms crossed, as a man in a golf shirt and khakis raised his hand and bought 1,500 acres for a fraction of its worth. The buyer, it turned out, was a developer with ties to the HOA board. By the following week, bulldozers were parked at the edge of his fields. For the first time in his life, Elijah was without the Carter land. He moved into a modest rental house in town, but he didn't allow bitterness to take root, not yet. Instead, he started studying. He spent hours in the law library, combing through property statutes, HOA regulations, and case law on fraudulent conveyance. He learned about quiet title actions, estoppel certificates, and the fine line between corporate authority and personal liability. It was during those long nights under the dim library lamps that he found the key. It was buried in the HOA's own bylaws, a provision that allowed the association, in the event of financial hardship, to sell common assets to satisfy debts. But there was a catch. Any such sale had to be approved by a majority vote of the property owners, and the bylaw's definition of property owner was tied to the recorded plat. A plan began to take shape. Elijah didn't have his land anymore, but he understood something the HOA hadn't considered. When they annexed his property into the subdivision, they had made him on paper a member of the HOA with full rights. That meant that when they sold his land, they had effectively sold a portion of the association's common assets. And if the HOA could sell assets under certain conditions, so could its members, if they followed the same procedures. The idea was dangerous. It would take time, money, and precision. But Elijah knew the truth. Sometimes the only way to fight people who twisted the law was to use the law itself, and he was ready to learn every inch of it. Elijah Carter had always believed that revenge taken in anger was a fool's errand. His father used to say, "If you swing wild, you miss. You swing smart, you win." Losing the Carter land to the Westbrook Homeowners Association had cut him to the bone, but Elijah refused to swing blind. Every hour he spent in the county law library was another step toward turning his loss into a calculated counterstrike. The deeper he dug, the more he realized the HOA had tied itself into a knot. In their greed, they hadn't just stolen his land. They'd roped themselves into a legal framework that now gave him standing within their organization. They had annexed his property into their subdivision without his consent, falsified his signature on the CC&Rs, and then, according to their own recorded plat, treated him as a full member until the property was sold. That meant two critical things. 1, he was technically entitled to participate in HOA decisions up until the moment they sold his land. 2, certain rights he'd gained as a member didn't automatically vanish with the sale, especially if he could prove the annexation itself was fraudulent. Elijah started with the HOA's bylaws. Buried in Section 8 was the clause he'd noticed before. In the event of financial hardship, the association, by a 2/3 vote of its members, may authorize the sale of common assets to satisfy debts. On the surface, this was meant for selling things like the community clubhouse, a pool, or maintenance equipment. But Elijah's research into state corporate law revealed something powerful. If an HOA improperly annexed land into its subdivision, any assets derived from that annexation could be construed as encumbered common property and could, under certain circumstances, be liquidated by members. It was a razor-thin interpretation, but it was enough to open a door. All he needed was a way to become a voting member again, legally, and to gather enough leverage to control the vote. Step 1. Getting back in. The HOA had sold his land, but they'd also made a subtle clerical mistake when filing the annexation plat. They had annexed not just his main property, but a tiny 1-acre strip of land that ran alongside the county road, land that Elijah had deeded years earlier to his cousin for a right-of-way. His cousin, a truck driver who lived 2 states over, had never developed the property, and it sat idle. With a single phone call, Elijah bought it back for a token $1. When the deed recorded, the county's tax records updated to show Elijah Carter as the owner of parcel 3874, officially part of Westbrook Subdivision, Phase 3. Just like that, he was a dues-paying HOA member again. Step 2. learning their weaknesses. Elijah began attending HOA meetings. He sat quietly in the back of the room during the first few, listening. He learned the personalities. Linda Matthews, the president, who loved the sound of her own voice and saw herself as a gatekeeper for neighborhood standards. Frank Reynolds, the treasurer, who handled the books and had a habit of glossing over the numbers too quickly. Melanie, the secretary, the same woman who'd answered the phone months earlier and who clearly relished the idea of holding power over residents. It didn't take long for Elijah to spot cracks. The HOA was running a budget deficit due to a failed community beautification project. They'd overspent on landscaping and repairs to the clubhouse roof, leaving them with barely enough in reserves to cover operating costs. Special assessments had been proposed, but were unpopular with homeowners, many of whom were already grumbling about rising dues. Step 3, building the case. While Elijah played the role of a quiet, disengaged member at meetings, he was anything but idle outside them. He hired a private investigator, an old friend from his days volunteering at the local legal aid clinic, to dig into the HOA board's dealings. Within 2 months, they had a thick folder of documents showing questionable reimbursements to board members, contracts awarded to companies owned by relatives of board members without competitive bidding, a pattern of filing liens against homeowners who disputed assessments, often resulting in quick foreclosures that transferred properties to investors connected to the board. Elijah also secured sworn affidavits from Mrs. Hargrove at the clerk's office and from a handwriting expert, both confirming the annexation signature on his original property's CC&Rs was forged. Step 4, forcing the vote. At the December meeting, Elijah raised his hand during new business. "I'd like to make a motion," he said evenly, his voice carrying across the crowded clubhouse. "Given the association's financial hardship and the provisions of Section 8 of our bylaws, I propose we hold a vote to sell certain common assets to satisfy debts." Linda Matthews laughed dismissively. "Mr. Carter, this isn't the time or place for—" "It is exactly the time and place," Elijah cut in, holding up a copy of the bylaws. "Section 8 says the motion can be made by any member in good standing. I paid my dues. I am a member, and the motion's been seconded." He didn't have to look to know his neighbor, Mr. Daniels, a retired machinist who'd been feuding with the HOA over his backyard shed, had raised his hand to second it. With no way to deny the motion without blatantly violating their own bylaws, the board was forced to set a date for a formal vote. Step 5, the alliance. Elijah knew he couldn't win the vote alone. The HOA had just over 80 voting members, and he needed a 2/3 majority. He began knocking on doors, not as a politician, but as a neighbor. He listened to grievances, fines for trivial landscaping, violations, threats over parked cars, sudden spikes in assessments. He didn't promise revenge, he promised relief. He explained in plain language that by liquidating certain HOA-owned parcels, vacant lots acquired through foreclosure, they could not only wipe out the debt, but also cut dues significantly. By the time the vote came around in January, Elijah had 56 committed yes votes, just enough. The vote. On a cold Tuesday evening, the HOA clubhouse was packed. Linda Matthews sat at the head table, clearly seething. "We will now vote on the motion to authorize the sale of certain common assets," she said, her voice tight. Ballots were distributed, collected, and counted in front of everyone. 56 in favor, 24 opposed. The motion passed. Elijah didn't smile. He simply nodded, as if this had been inevitable. Step 6, the execution. The board was legally bound to follow the vote. The HOA attorney, clearly uncomfortable, began drafting sale agreements for the identified parcels. Under the bylaws, the member who initiated the motion, Elijah, was authorized to coordinate the sale on the association's behalf, provided the transactions were approved by a licensed attorney. Elijah already had one waiting, a property lawyer from the city with a reputation for airtight contracts. Within weeks, Elijah had lined up buyers for nearly a dozen HOA-owned lots. But these weren't random buyers. They were shell companies he'd quietly formed months earlier, all under the control of a trust with his name nowhere on it. The purchases were legal, the prices fair market, and every document above board. The HOA received the proceeds, which cleared their debts, but the land now rested in entities Elijah controlled. Step 7. The reveal. Once the dust settled, Elijah's trust began selling those parcels to private developers, one by one. In several cases, the parcels contained access roads, easements, or community amenities. When the new owners closed them off or repurposed them, residents were forced to either buy them back or adjust to losing them entirely. By summer, the HOA's property values began to dip and discontent boiled over. Board members resigned under pressure. Linda Matthews herself stepped down after a recall petition. Elijah had taken the first half of his revenge. But the second half, the part that would make the HOA truly understand the weight of what they had done, was still to come. Because buried in those transactions, quietly and deliberately, Elijah had acquired something else entirely: the undeveloped land on which half the HOA's homes physically sat. By the time Elijah Carter had maneuvered the Westbrook Homeowners Association into selling him their most valuable common assets, most residents still had no idea what had happened. They thought the parcels he'd purchased were isolated lots or strips of unused land. What they didn't realize, at least not yet, was that in 3 specific cases, the unused land wasn't empty at all. This was the part of property law Elijah understood better than most attorneys: the difference between owning a structure and owning the land beneath it. In Westbrook, much of the original subdivision had been built on a mix of individually owned parcels and HOA-owned common land that had been leased to homeowners through long-term land use agreements. It was cheaper for the original developer to do it that way, but it also created a legal time bomb. If the HOA ever sold that land, the leases could be terminated or renegotiated under entirely new terms. And now Elijah owned it. The first sign of trouble came when residents on Ridgeview Court received notices from the Westbrook HOA advising them that their land leases had been transferred to a private entity, Carter Holdings Trust. The notice was polite, factual, and contained no threats. It simply stated that effective immediately, all future lease payments should be made to Carter Holdings, and that lease renewals, due the following year, would be handled directly with the new owner. Some ignored it. Others called the HOA board, who in turn called the HOA's attorney, who confirmed, grudgingly, that the transfer was perfectly legal. The HOA had voted to sell those parcels, and Carter Holdings had purchased them fair and square. Elijah didn't go knocking on doors. He let time do the work. As the renewal dates approached, homeowners began receiving updated lease agreements. The terms were stark. Annual lease payments tripled. Failure to sign would result in termination of the lease. Upon termination, the homeowner would have 90 days to remove the structure from the land or negotiate a purchase of the parcel at market value. The panic was immediate. Removing a house from its foundation wasn't an option, and purchasing the land, now appraised at a steep market rate, would cost more than some residents had paid for the homes themselves. One evening in early March, Elijah got a call from a man named Greg Thompson, who owned one of the Ridgeview Court homes. Greg's voice was tense. "Mr. Carter, look, I think we got off on the wrong foot here. I didn't have anything to do with what the HOA did to you. I just bought my place 3 years ago. My wife's pregnant. We can't afford what you're asking for the land. Isn't there something we can work out?" Elijah was silent for a long moment. "Greg," he said finally, "I'm not in the business of making people homeless. I'm in the business of making sure the people who wrong me understand the cost of their actions. If you're willing to testify to what you know about the HOA's practices, under oath, I'll work something out for you." Greg hesitated, then agreed. Within a week, Elijah had 3 signed affidavits from different homeowners detailing everything from fraudulent fines to threats of foreclosure for minor violations. Each statement became another brick in the wall Elijah was building for the next phase, dismantling the HOA entirely. The legal strike. With the evidence gathered, Elijah filed a civil lawsuit against the Westbrook Homeowners Association for fraud, unjust enrichment, and civil conspiracy. His claim was straightforward. The HOA had illegally annexed his land, profited from its sale, and continued to operate under fraudulent pretenses that harmed both him and other residents. The lawsuit sent shockwaves through the community. HOA meetings turned hostile, with residents demanding answers from the board. The local paper picked up the story, running it under the headline, Local man claims HOA stole his land, fights back with legal ownership of subdivision lots. Suddenly, what had been a private feud became public scandal. In depositions, Elijah's attorney forced the board members to admit they had never obtained Elijah's consent for annexation and had relied on documents provided by the developer that were never verified. The handwriting expert's report on the forged signature became Exhibit A. Under mounting pressure, the HOA's insurer advised settling. But Elijah wasn't after a quiet payout. His demands were non-negotiable. 1. Dissolution of the Westbrook Homeowners Association. 2. Transfer of all remaining common assets to Carter Holdings Trust. 3. Public admission of wrongdoing by the board members involved. The board fought back, but their position crumbled under the weight of the evidence. Facing the possibility of personal liability, several members resigned mid-litigation, leaving a skeleton crew who ultimately voted to accept Elijah's terms. The aftermath. The day the dissolution documents were signed, Elijah walked the boundary of his original property, what had once been Carter land, and thought about his great-grandfather. The 1,500 acres were gone, yes, but in their place stood something else, a legal legacy. Word spread quickly that Westbrook was no longer an HOA community. Without the association to manage common areas or enforce covenants, property values dipped further. Some residents sold their homes outright to avoid the new land lease terms. Others negotiated directly with Carter Holdings to purchase the parcels under their houses, often at prices that left Elijah with more profit than the land had ever earned as farmland. Not everyone hated him. The ones who had suffered under the HOA's petty tyranny thanked him quietly. A few even offered to help him develop the parcels he now controlled into something better, something fairer. The last board meeting. Months later, Elijah attended what would be the final special meeting of the Westbrook HOA. It was held not in the clubhouse, but in a cramped conference room at the county courthouse. Only 4 people showed up: Linda Matthews, Frank Reynolds, and 2 remaining board members. Linda's face was pale as she signed the dissolution paperwork. She didn't look at Elijah until the very end, when she said, "You destroyed this neighborhood." Elijah met her gaze evenly. "No, Linda. You destroyed it when you decided the law didn't apply to you. I just made sure the law remembered my name." With that, he left the room, the echo of his boots on the tile following him out into the spring sunlight. For the first time in years, Elijah felt something close to peace. He hadn't gotten the Carter land back, but he had taken back something else: control. And in doing so, he had sent a message far beyond the borders of Westbrook, one that would be whispered in boardrooms and HOA meetings for years to come. In the end, Elijah didn't need to keep every parcel he'd acquired. He sold some, leased others, and donated a strip of land to the county for a public park. The rest he kept, not for profit, but as a reminder that no one, no matter how organized or powerful, could take from him without consequence. And somewhere, in a quiet corner of the county records office, his great-grandfather's original deed sat in its folder, untouched, still bearing the Carter name. In a world full of noise, we follow the quiet truth stories that reveal, awaken, and transform. If this story moved you, like, comment, and subscribe for more untold narratives that challenge perception and stir the soul. Hit the bell so you never miss when the compass points us to the next hidden truth. This is Hidden Compass Stories, where every story leads somewhere deeper.